So if I can make a short presentation while you're looking for your paper. So this is morning coffee for Just Peace, which is a 1-hour webinar arranged once a month, and it is organized by the Working Group for Central and Eastern Europe of the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Finland. And my name is Ari Ojel, and I'm the secretary of the working group, and I've been trusted the honor of moderating these morning coffee discussions. And today we have a very interesting and important theme and discussion ahead of us. After the unjustified and unjust war against Ukraine, we are longing not only peace, but peace that is just, a just peace. This is what we wish to promote, and this is what we want, also as churches having relations with other churches, to give our share in building. And today we ask, what might just peace mean from the viewpoint of the Ukrainian churches? And I think it's fair to say the complex ecclesiastical realities in the country. And I can think of no other person that we'd rather have today for leading us to the reflection of the question I just mentioned than Father Cyril Hovorun, a professor of ecclesiology, international relations and ecumenism at the University College Stockholm, a native-born Ukrainian, an Orthodox priest who has formerly served as a chairman of the Department for External Church Relations of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and also as the first deputy chairman of the Educational Committee of the Russian Orthodox Church. A scholar with great intellectual integrity and a theologian of deep theological insight and vision. Can it be? Yes, it can. And today we have the great pleasure of trusting ourselves to his hands for 40 minutes. So please, Father Cyril, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And I primarily thank the Lutheran Church of Finland for inviting me to this discussion. I believe it is indeed a very important discussion. It is important for the ecumenical circles. It is important for the inter-Christian relations. It is important for the global Christianity, I believe. Let me start with a remark that I have noticed a tendency that global conversations about peace in Ukraine in the context of the ongoing war are becoming as important, or maybe even more important, than conversations about war per se. And I believe this is a promising tendency. Everybody in Ukraine wants peace. I just came from Ukraine a few days ago here to Europe, and I can testify that everyone wants peace in Ukraine. Therefore, talking to the Ukrainians about peace is like preaching to the choir. I observed two kinds of conversation about peace. One is firmly based on the understanding of the reasons and nature of the ongoing war. Of course, it is probably an overstretch to claim that anyone understands why Putin started this war. Even Putin does not understand it if you ask him what are his real motives, his real reasons to wage this war. The complete understanding of the war is still ahead of us. Still, people and agencies that really care about peace in Ukraine try as much as they can to grasp what is behind this war. In describing the war, they try to avoid euphemisms and explicitly name both its victims and perpetrators. And I believe this is a very important precondition in any dealing with the war in Ukraine, to name explicitly the victims and perpetrators. On the basis of the understanding of how the war started, they try to figure out how it should end. So it's another precondition for any conversation about just peace, to figure out, to understand the beginning of the war in order to understand its end. So those people realized that February 24, 2022 happened because the peace initiatives after February 2014, I should remind that February 2014 was when the war started with the annexation of Crimea, and what we had in February 2022 was just a continuation, escalation of this war. And those initiatives that started after February 2014 failed not only because Russia decided so, which is also true, but also because they sometimes were naive and unrealistic. Sometimes they sought peace at the expense of the victim and not the perpetrator. Well, there were talks of, forcing Ukraine to peace negotiations with Russia and to yielding to Russia, which only encouraged the perpetrator. They too often looked for their own interests, as in the notorious case of the sweet deal between Russia's Gazprom and Germany, the notorious Nord Stream pipeline. Its completion became one of the triggers for February 2022. Peacemakers in this category learn lessons from their previous mistakes and in most cases do not want to repeat them. Another kind of peacemakers repeat their mistakes, either consciously or unconsciously. The latter are incurably naive, and the former do not seem to really care about peace, well, in my judgment. What they care about more is how their peacemaking can help them as institutions and or their agendas. Take, for example, Xi Jinping, the president of China, or Noam Chomsky, the famous American philosopher. You cannot imagine people with more opposite political and ethical principles. Yet they converge in how they want peace for Ukraine. Their formula of peace envisages preserving Russia as a global player, even if that would mean that it can start another war sometime rather soon, and diminishing the global role of the West, especially the United States. They say they do care about Ukrainian life, but we in Ukraine are afraid that this care will cost even more Ukrainian or other people's life in the long run. There are also professional peacemakers. Many of them are affiliated with churches or interchurch agencies. They often like contemplating themselves to be in the center of the peacemaking process more than they like sustainable peace to be actually achieved. They promote peace regardless of the consequences of their efforts for actual peace. In other words, they often act as populist politicians. They are, in effect, populist peacemakers. Or, to use Dietrich Bonhoeffer's famous words, they pursue cheap peace. I call it cheap peace. Unfortunately, and that's what I wanted to discuss in my conversation primarily, the role of the World Council of Churches in the peacemaking efforts in Ukraine. The WCC, as it is known, is an organization that is supposed to advocate for peace by its own nature. However, unfortunately, so far it has indicated that it belongs more to the latter than to the former category of peacemakers. Following its General Assembly in Karlsruhe in September 2022, I had a chance to explain earlier how this organization missed an opportunity to help the Russian Orthodox Church to change its attitude to the war. Instead, the WCC allowed to be used by the Russians for the purposes of their propaganda, in the name of dialogue and peacemaking, of course. Let me repeat some points that I raised in my early publication, published it in a Religion and Praxis blog run by Lund University in Sweden, and then repeated in my presentation for the annual ecumenical talk at Münster University, organized by the Ecumenical Institute at Münster University. So I published this piece in October 2022, following the General Assembly of the WCC, and then following the following visit of the acting director of the WCC at the time, Father Ivan Savka, to Moscow. So let me repeat a bit myself. The World Council of Churches was established in the aftermath of the World War II. Therefore, it is supposed to embed in its very design the mechanisms of alarming about and dealing with military conflicts. The war in Ukraine was supposed to trigger such an alarm, but it did not. This war started in February 2014, when Russia, as I said, annexed Crimea and waged a proxy war in Donbass. The WCC reacted belatedly by sending its delegation to Ukraine in March 2015, more than a year later. The delegation published a communique with some ambivalent assessments, such as the following one, and I quote the statement, which was produced in March 2015 a bit more than 1 year after the war started by the WCC after they visited Ukraine. During this visit, I quote, "The delegation has heard different perspectives on the origins of the conflict. In any event, the delegation is convinced of the potential of the churches and faith communities of Ukraine to play a lead role in transcending the competing nationalisms." Well, nationalisms is like a keyword that predispose groups towards conflict, end of quote. In the WCC's interpretation, the war was a competition of nationalisms. The statement thus univocally implied a Ukrainian nationalism, so to say, as the main reason that had provoked the Russian aggression. I'd like to stress this word nationalism because it's like a pivotal term that permeates the discourse of the WCC through the years of this war. And I believe to put the Ukrainian nationalism, the supposed Ukrainian nationalism, as the main reason that had provoked the Russian aggression was a grave misreading of the events of 2014. The aggression became a reaction to the Ukrainian Revolution of Dignity, which, as we remember, happened in the winter 2013-2014, which had been driven not by nationalism, but by the longing of the Ukrainian civil society for justice, transparency, and solidarity, the supposedly core Western values of the WCC's own ethics. The members of the WCC's delegation failed to see that Ukraine was effectively fighting for these very core values that the WCC seems to stand for. 7 years later, the Russian propaganda inflated the Ukrainian nationalism, which is kind of implied in the WCC statement, to a Ukrainian neo-Nazism, which was presented as the main pretext to start a full-scale war. The WCC statement facilitated this inflation, I believe. Of course, it was not the delegation's intention, but its visit to Ukraine was used by the Russian Orthodox Church to promote messages it wanted to broadcast globally through the platform of the WCC. It is also worthy to note that the statement put the two sides of the conflict on an equal footing, a tradition that continues to our days. That is another weak point in the WCC statements that permeates all the discourses and statements produced by this organization throughout the years of the war. So after the statement was published in early 2015, for about 7 years, the WCC did not emit clear signals about the war that went on the European continent, even though it had promised, and I quote, its statement, to find the means and the methods by which it can accompany the churches and people of Ukraine in a pilgrimage of justice and peace. So there was a promise to accompany, the people and churches of Ukraine, but this promise was never delivered. First signals from the WCC came soon after the war escalated in February 2022, and some of them were even poorer than the one in 2015, unfortunately. Thus, in response to the Ukrainian First Lady's plea to the WCC to become Ukraine's, and I quote the letter, moral and active ally, the acting General Secretary, Father Ioan Savka, at the time, to whom the letter was addressed, personally published his own letter, his own response, addressing both President Zelensky and President Putin. In his letter, he continued the tradition of putting Russia and Ukraine on equal footing, as, for example, in the following passage. On both sides there is suffering and despair, and all are waiting for an end of the conflict. I quote this letter. Excellencies, the end of conflict and the agreement on a peaceful solution is in your hands alone. Before your people in history, you will be the only one responsible for it. No one from outside can solve or seek to impose any solution to this fraternal conflict. End of quote. Imagine this letter to be sent in the period of the Winter War in Finland to Stalin and the leadership of Finland at the time, asking both sides, to come to terms at peace, because it's up to them, if it was up to them to end this war. So imagine, apply this to the Finnish situation, and you will have the picture how it was perceived in Ukraine. Indeed, this letter caused outrage in Ukraine, but not only in Ukraine, in some ecumenical circles as well, who exercised some pressure on the WCC. As a result, Father Ioan published a new letter, now addressed to the Patriarch of Moscow, Kirill. This time, the letter was closer to the reality of the war. Notwithstanding this one, the signals emitted by the WCC were not helpful for the Ukrainians and those in the world who solidarized with them. They looked forward to the upcoming 11th General Assembly of the WCC in Karlsruhe with hope that it would send a clearer message regarding the war. Such hopes were based on the fact that many reputable international organizations had already clearly condemned the aggressor, Russia. The war in Ukraine was widely discussed both in the official meetings of the General Assembly and in its corridors. The Ukrainians were given floor to bring up their concerns. The conversations about Ukraine in Karlsruhe culminated in the discussions of the statement, War in Ukraine, Peace and Justice in the European region. This statement came out to be better than many, including myself, expected. I was pleasantly surprised how well written that statement was. In general, it was at the same time not much different from the statements of other international organizations that have condemned the Russian aggression. The General Assembly statement also condemned the war and named the aggressor, which was important. And I quote the statement, "This assembly denounces this illegal and unjustifiable war." At the same time, the statement continued treating Ukraine and Russia on the equal footing. In the line with the ill tradition of the early WCC statements on Ukraine, it appealed to all sides in the conflict to respect the principles of international humanitarian law, including especially with regard to the protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure, and for the humane treatment of prisoners of war. End of quote. The WCC also renewed its call for an immediate ceasefire to halt the death and destruction, and for dialogue and negotiations to secure sustainable peace. However, it did not specify to whom this call was addressed, which was quite disappointing. So it was like just, broadcasting those nice messages to ether with no particular addressee. In the process of drafting the declaration of the on war in Ukraine, peace and justice in the European region, the WCC violated the basic principle of international diplomacy regarding Ukraine: nothing about Ukraine without the Ukrainians. So this is like a principle sine qua non for any negotiations about Ukraine, well, at least in the civilized world. The drafting group included a Russian representative, but not a Ukrainian one, which was ultimately absurd. In discussing the statement, the Ukrainians were again put to a disadvantaged position in comparison with the Russians. The two Ukrainian delegates were given only 1 minute each to express themselves about the draft, while the Russian delegate, Father Filaret Bulekov, was given 6 minutes, which is far beyond the regulations. No doubt, he used his time, generously granted by the moderator, to promote the Russian narratives about the war. In particular, he likened the mentioned document, the statement, to the statements coming from McDonald's or Starbucks. A Ukrainian delegate, Alexandra Kovalenko, during her 1 minute intervention, used it very well this minute, and she reacted. She said, "Dear brothers and sisters, I'm asking you to hear me and not to compromise the obvious truth for the sake of diplomacy. Just name it as it is, Russian aggression against Ukraine. If the churches aren't the ones raising their voices when there is violence and injustice happening, will we still be the salt of the earth?" I also appealed to the delegation of the Russian Orthodox Church and asked them, if you are against the war of the Russian Federation against Ukraine, please raise your blue cards. That was the way to express vote. It is very sad that you compare the blood of the Ukrainian people with Starbucks and McDonald's, end of quote. Not a single Russian delegate raised his or her card against the war at the time. The Ukrainian delegates could not raise their cards because, unlike the Russians, they did not have rights to vote. The WCC leadership justified the Russian participation in the General Assembly by the need for dialogue. Father Ivan Sauka stated in his introductory speech, and I quote him, "The WCC was created as an open platform for dialogue and encounter, for discussion and challenging one another on the path of unity." End of quote. However, was there a real and meaningful dialogue that the Russian delegation became engaged in during the General Assembly? Indeed, it met several religious leaders. The Russian delegation met several religious leaders including the representatives of the WCC's leadership. However, according to the relevant information published on the official website of the Department for External Church Relations of the Moscow Patriarchate, the Russians used these meetings to promote narratives and interpretations of the war in tune with the Kremlin's propaganda. This has been also confirmed by a member of the Russian delegation, Metropolitan Leonid of Klin, who posted on his social media on the last day of the assembly, and I quote him, "Thanks God, we accomplished our mission and did what we could," meaning that they felt that their mission of promoting the Russian narratives at the General Assembly was successful. So he believed. Moreover, some Russian delegates used their presence in Karlsruhe to insult the Ukrainian delegation. The mentioned Russian bishop Leonid of Klin described, and I quote him from his social media, the Ukrainian performance at the WCC as boring because, in his words, there was no feminine group. As you know, it's feminine group. It's like a Ukrainian group of protesters, female protesters. They perform sometimes with bare-breasted kind of performances against whatever they want to protest against. So for Leonid, he wanted this kind of feminine group to perform, and he was bored because they were not performing, in his words. At the end, he continues, the violinist played something sad. He played out of tune, putting a bullet in the general line of falseness of Ukrainian speakers. That was the statement of this person, really a senior hierarch in the Russian church, like second in command in the Russian delegation in Karlsruhe. So the Russian delegation used this platform of dialogue, as it was presented by the WCC, mostly to propagate the Kremlin's narratives and insult the Ukrainians. The federal president of Germany, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, therefore was right when he warned the WCC in his address on the first day of the assembly, and I quote him, "Dialogue must bring to light what is happening. Dialogue must draw attention to injustice, must justify both victims and perpetrators, must identify both victims and perpetrators and their henchmen. Yet dialogue that does not move beyond pious wishes and vague generalizations can, in the worst case, become a platform for vindication and propaganda." The Russians were very upset by this speech and expressed their dismay both officially and unofficially. This is probably because the federal president nailed down their real intentions. Even the most naive Western politicians, such as Steinmeier, who before February 2022 was notoriously short-sighted about the Russian intentions and advocated for dialogue at any price, finally learned their lesson that the Russians usually hijack dialogues to promote their own agendas. The Russians interpreted Steinmeier's speech as an illustration of how politicians in the West interfere in the matters of the church. This was a clear manipulation, and the Russians effectively extrapolated upon Germany the Moscow Patriarchate's own experience in Russia. The mentioned Metropolitan Leonid posted on his social media, and I quote him, "Steinmeier directly demanded from the delegation of the Russian Orthodox Church to express a clear position. It was a public pressure, which mounted almost to threats. Well, our church is accustomed to pressure. Peoples in many other regions of the world also know well what the Western pressure and persecutions are." Leonid concluded his deliberations on Steinmeier's speech with these words. He finished to prolonged applauses. And this senior Russian hierarch meant orgasm. So imagine what kind of language he uses. Following the General Assembly, the World Council of Churches official delegation, headed by Father Ioan Sauka, visited Moscow and met Patriarch Kirill there. They believe they achieved a breakthrough in the conversation with the Russian Patriarch. The WCC official website, on its front page, published in a celebratory mood. His Holiness Patriarch Kirill, WCC Acting General Secretary, meet in Moscow, agreeing that war cannot be holy. I believe there was not much to celebrate. As first, the Patriarch never stated that any war could be holy. Second, he never called the war in Ukraine a war. According to the Russian propaganda playbook, it is a special operation. Therefore, by condemning wars, the Patriarch by default excludes the Russian special operation Ukraine from this category. Third, He had called this war metaphysical, which is not the same as holy. Being metaphysical could also mean infernal, which I would agree with when it comes to the Ukrainian war. In the communique, which was agreed upon by the WCC delegation and its Moscow hosts, the Patriarch, while condemning wars in principle, made an explicit exception for the Russian special operation in Ukraine. He explained that it is supported by the political context, as he said, and the churches must not add fuel to the fire. The well-intended Western public would read this message as following: the war is waged by the Kremlin and the Russian Orthodox Church wants to abstain from supporting it. However, the Patriarch meant exactly the opposite. The war happens only because the Western politicians want so, and the global Christianity should not solidarize with what they impose on Russia. Unfortunately, many in the global ecumenical community would agree with such reading of the events. The Patriarch tried to reach out to them. He managed to use the platform of the WCC and its loudspeaking facilities to address the ecumenical urbi, so to say, Geneva, which is an ecumenical urbs, and Orbi through the front page of the World Council of Churches website. He channeled through it the main message of the Kremlin's propaganda. This is a war of the West against innocent Russia. The West should stop punishing Russia for that, and the churches across the globe should advocate for that. The WCC, thus, again allowed to be instrumentalized by the Russian propaganda. Although its sincere intention is to stop the war, it continues against its will, contributing to it by offering a platform to this propaganda. Such helplessness also indirectly boosts the legitimacy of Putin's regime by legitimizing its main legitimizer, the Russian Orthodox Church. We observed the same pattern in 2015, and we observe it still. Lessons have not been learned. Therefore, one should not be surprised that the Moscow Patriarchate, in statements following the General Assembly and during the visit of the WCC leaders to Moscow, has been unusually generous in giving compliments to the Council and its leadership. I believe it is not just a form of diplomatic appeasement. In this case, Moscow finally means what it says. And Moscow continues to praise the leadership of the WCC for its peacemaking efforts, which is a token. After the General Assembly and the ambivalent visit to Moscow that followed it, I hope that the new leadership, which was elected at the General Assembly, would behave wiser and avoid being instrumentalized by Moscow again. Very unfortunately, the visits of the new General Assembly of the WCC, Jerry Pillai, and his companions to Kiev and Moscow in May 2023 proved me to be wrong in my hopes. It seems lessons were not learned and mistakes were repeated or became worse. The WCC delegation's visit to Ukraine, which indeed happened in the middle of May, a few weeks ago, surprisingly was facilitated by the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which has preserved its implicit relations with the Moscow Patriarchate. By the way, the fact that the delegation accepted the invitation of the church. So the initiative came from the Ukrainian Church of the Moscow Patriarchate to the delegation of the WCC to visit. And I've heard, and this has been confirmed by many sources that I've consulted in Ukraine, that the Ukrainian Orthodox Church even paid for the visit of the WCC's delegation to Ukraine. The fact that the WCC accepted the invitation of the Ukrainian Church of the Moscow Patriarchate and met the leadership of the church in the first place means that for the WCC, the Ukrainian Church is still the part of the Moscow Patriarchate, and through the Moscow Patriarchate is a member church of the WCC. If, the WCC, if the Ukrainian Church were not a part of the Russian Orthodox Church, then it would have not been a WCC's members through the Russian Orthodox Church, and as such would have been ineligible for the official meetings with the delegation. Instead, the WCC, as I said, not only met the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate's leaders in the first place immediately after the arrival at Kiev, but also accepted that this church reportedly covered a significant part of the expenses of the visit. This fact immediately puts into question the impartiality of the WCC's delegation. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate made its generous contribution to the visit, not because of its sincere commitment to ecumenism, in Karlsruhe, Metropolitan Onufri, the head of the Ukrainian Church Moscow Patriarchate, sent a very modest delegation consisting only of lay people, and their only agenda was to promote the narratives about the persecutions, alleged persecutions against the church in Ukraine. So there was no any ecumenical interest, for the church to be involved in in Karlsruhe, except only, an opportunity to promote their own agenda against the Ukrainian state's oppressions. The same reason was behind the invitation to the WCC delegation to visit Kiev this time. The primate of the church, Metropolitan Onufri, refused to meet the delegation personally. So the church invited the delegation, and Onufri, Metropolitan Onufri, the head of the church, refused to meet them because for him, the danger of apostasy by, touching even the WCC, by talking to them, it would mean that he became like impure. He would become infected by this heresy of ecumenism, as they believe, as they call it. So for the WCC delegation for Onufri was like untouchable heretics, so to say. That's why he decided not to meet them. Instead, he delegated to meet the delegation to his right hand, Metropolitan Anthony Borispil and Brovary. He's the church's chancellor. And Metropolitan Anthony, dedicated his entire speech, his entire presentation to the delegation of the WCC to the alleged persecutions against his church in Ukraine. The WCC delegation probably experienced a cognitive dissonance when, following the meeting with the Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine, it met the All-Ukrainian Council of Churches and Religious Organizations. The Lutheran bishop, who is, a Ukrainian Lutheran bishop, Vyacheslav Horpenchuk, who at that time presided in the council. The system in the council is that the council is presided every half a year by a member, a leader of the member church. And this time it coincided, it was a Lutheran bishop, Vyacheslav Horpenchuk, as I said. So he made a statement on behalf of the council, and he said in particular, I quote him, freedom of religion is respected in Ukraine, and there are no religious persecutions, even during the war. Instead, what the believers on the Ukrainian territories occupied by Russia experience remains extremely dangerous. Terrorizing the civilian population, especially religious figures, is a common intimidation and subjugation tactic practiced by the Russian occupation authorities. We hope that the voice of the WCC will be heard in the world in defense of the believers who suffer daily due to the presence of the Russian occupiers on Ukrainian soil. So the WCC delegation faced two kinds of discussions, two kinds of conversation from the Ukrainian Church Moscow Patriarchate, which invited them, and then from the All-Ukrainian Council of Churches and Religious Organizations. The former case, there was no any mentioning of the Russian persecutions or any Russian hostility towards Ukrainians on the occupied territories. However, a lot of conversation about the hostility of the Ukrainian state to this particular church. From the All-Ukrainian Council of Churches and Religious Organizations, the rhetoric was completely different, opposite. They stated there are no persecutions in Ukraine against the Ukrainian churches, but there are persecutions from the Russians against the Ukrainian churches on the occupied territories. Contrary to this statement from the All-Ukrainian Council of Churches, it seems that the press release published by the WCC following these conversations reflected more the position of the Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine than the position of the All-Ukrainian Churches Council. So the WCC press release reported concerns regarding religious freedom and rights in the context of government measures to remove the Ukrainian Orthodox Church's institutions and monastic communities from the Lavra. On the other hand, no non-similar statements has uttered a single word about multiple violations of religious freedom on the occupied territories or in Russia. This double standard demonstrated by the WCC was praised by Patriarch Kirill during his meeting with the WCC delegation on May 17, 2023. Earlier in January, such a double standard was condemned at the special meeting of the United Nations Security Council. So in January 2023, Russia called for this meeting to discuss the assumed persecutions against the Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine. This is really a favorite trope of the Russian propaganda, which the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate corroborates. And in this point, they converge very, very closely. I mean, Moscow Patriarchate and the Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine. Most of the Security Council's members, when it was brought to the table of the Security Council of the United Nations, dismissed the Russian assumptions. The French ambassador to the United Nations, Nicolas de Rivière, summarized their position. In his words, and I quote him, "The Russian initiative was another example of the Russian Federation's cynical misinformation strategy, namely claiming to defend religious freedom even as it openly defies a ceasefire and civilians continue to suffer." He added, "Since the beginning of the aggression against Ukraine, the Russian Federation has continued to commit serious human rights violations, including forced displacement, sexual violence, deprivation of the right to freely practice religion, and crimes against children." As was mentioned, this is the end of quote, as was mentioned, not a single hint of such violations was indicated in the WCC's press release about its delegation's meetings in Moscow or in the interview that the General Secretary gave after coming back to Geneva. So Jerry Pillai gave a long interview after he came back to Geneva from Moscow following the tradition set by, I think, by Father Ion Savka, because after Father Ion Savka met Patriarch Kirill in Moscow, he also came back to Geneva and gave a long interview where he explained what he meant. So even in the interview that followed, Jerry Pillai did not acknowledge any problem from the Moscow side regarding Ukraine. Yes, and I should also mention that these meetings in Moscow on the 17th of May happened in the days when the Kievans, the citizens of Kiev, the inhabitants of Kiev, experienced the most massive Russian missile attacks since the beginning of the war. I was in Kiev at the time. I saw how it happened from the balcony of my house. It was horrible, and it was not mentioned at all from the WCC delegation. Needless to say that this fact was not, it was not mentioned by the WCC. Instead, the official information about the visit published on the website of the WCC is cautiously laudatory for the primate of the Russian Orthodox Church. I did not find any contradiction between the WCC and the Russian Orthodox Church's reports about the meeting. So there were two statements, two texts, one coming from the WCC, a shorter one, and then a longer one coming from the official website of the Russian Orthodox Church. I didn't see any contradiction between the two reports. In his interview after the visit, however, Jerry Pillai stated that the way in which Moscow presented the visit does not cover what the WCC delegation responded to the Patriarch's point. So there was an acknowledgement that the Moscow report, even though it is longer than the WCC report, did not cover the response of the WCC. The problem is that the WCC did not express publicly any of those concerns that they presumably expressed in the meeting with the Patriarch. The only concern that Jerry Pillai explicitly mentioned is nationalism. Now we come back to this, key word of nationalism that that was in the center of the WCC's explanations of the war since 2015. Usually, as I said, it is Ukraine and not Russia which is accused of nationalism. Therefore, when we speak about nationalism in the context of the war in Ukraine, people, because of the Russian propaganda, people think about the Ukrainian nationalism. Because Putin and the Russian propaganda insist that they are against, they fight Ukrainian nationalism in Ukraine. As a result, any accusation of nationalism can be easily dismissed by the Russians. So they will say, of course, it's about nationalism. We condemn nationalism as well as Jerry Pillai does. because we are fighting, and moreover, we are fighting against nationalism in Ukraine. That is the purpose of our war. What the Russians promote instead is a form of imperialism. The General Secretary did not note any hint of Russian imperialism, even though, for example, several days before that, a very influential Russian hierarch, Metropolitan Tikhon Shevkunov of Pskov, who is believed to be like the spiritual father of Putin, gave a long interview to Ksenia Sobchak. She's like a media diva in Russia, where he explained the Russian behavior in this war. And he said, Russia is an empire. Russia cannot be not an empire. It's like in the DNA of Russia. So he explicitly said that imperialism, imperial thinking is behind the Russian behavior. And it was never mentioned in any of the WCC statements, including in Jerry Pillai's assessment of the visit. In my opinion, Jerry Pillai's references to nationalism brought the WCC back to the unfortunate statement from 2015 about competing nationalisms. It looks like a vicious circle of poor arguments that help the perpetrator more than they help the victim. In other words, what the WCC by its statements and wording achieve eventually is they, against their will, facilitate Moscow, and they disable Ukraine. The Moscow Patriarchate, the Patriarch of Moscow was much more careful and articulate when he stated his concerns and accusations during the meeting with the General Secretary and his companions. It seems that the most important point, which the Patriarch really cares about, and which were referred to in the Russian reports, are the sanctions. In the Patriarch's interpretation, and I quote him, after the 11th General Assembly of the World Council of Churches, the President of Ukraine imposed personal sanctions on 3 members of the delegation of the Russian Orthodox Church for the mere fact of informal participation in the discussion of the Ukrainian problem. So in Patriarch's interpretation, the members of the Russian Church were sanctioned by the Ukrainian government because they were involved in the peace negotiations. One of those sanctioned hierarchs is the mentioned Metropolitan Leonid Gorbachev, who after the General Assembly was defrocked by the Patriarchate of Alexandria. So now he is like a defrocked metropolitan, he's a lay person. I described his hate speech earlier. After the General Assembly, Leonid's public rhetoric became even more hating and war-mongering. So he came back from Karlsruhe and he continued, accusing Ukraine, and he ended up in really the extreme form of hate speech against Ukraine. He went as far as suggesting, for example, nuking Ukraine, sending, retaliating Ukraine with nuclear bombs. Imagine something like this urges to nuke a country coming from a Russian hierarch. In the Patriarch's interpretation, he was involved in the peacemaking conversations. But he was sanctioned by Ukraine exactly for his hate speech and for his calls, to nuke Ukraine and to continue this war in Ukraine. He is now the loudest church-affiliated megaphone of the Russian propaganda in its most radical form. Not his alleged informal participation in the discussion of the Ukrainian problem, but his war-mongering words and deeds became the reason for the Ukrainian sanctions against him. But the WCC's delegation did not seem to bother itself with such nuances. The General Secretary, according to the Russian report, concurred with the interpretation suggested by the Patriarch of Moscow. And I quote Patriarch Kirill in this. I quote Patriarch Kirill, I quote the Russian report, how it represents the words of Jerry Pillai. So in Jerry Pillai's words, you mentioned, I quote him, you mentioned the assembly in Karlsruhe, and now we understand that our statement and actions can have certain consequences, especially on the part of the president of Ukraine, end of quote. If Jerry Pillai's words have been rendered correctly, and he has not objected the Moscow Patriarchate's rendition of this conversation, Moscow, then it is, I believe, an insult to the Ukrainian president and the people he represents. As far as I know, the WCC, this is kind of probably you will have You will hear for the first time this information. As far as I know, the WCC delegation, before visiting Kyiv, approached the presidential office asking for a meeting with the First Lady, Olena Zelenska. The fact that the request was not gratified, and it was not gratified, can be justified retrospectively given the statements made in Moscow. The earlier disastrous response of Father Sauka to the First Lady's letter also played its role in the cold reaction from the Ukrainian president to the WCC initiatives. To add to the insult, the Patriarch awarded with an order, a high order of the Russian Church. He gave this order to the Russian representative to the WCC, Father Mikhail Gundyaev, or his nephew, right during the meeting with the WCC delegation. Father Mikhail has been sanctioned by the Ukrainian government together with Leonid Gorbachev. So imagine a person who has been sanctioned by the Ukrainian government. He was present in the meeting with the WCC, and the Patriarch gave him this honorary award in the presence of Jerry Pillai. And the WCC was not bothered that the person under the sanctions was celebrated in such provocative way in its General Secretary's presence, as it is not bothered that he continues working in the WCC offices in Geneva. Another point that the Patriarch stressed in his address to the WCC delegation related to the humanitarian aid for the Ukrainians on the Russian territories, as well as on the Ukrainian territories occupied by Russia. He praised the role of the Russian Church, but also acknowledged the input of the WCC and its humanitarian agencies. In particular, he mentioned with appreciation how the Director of the International Affairs of the WCC, Peter Proof, visited in May 2022 the facilities with displaced Ukrainians in the Rostov region of Russia, as well as how the acting General Secretary of the WCC at the time, Father Ivan Sauka, visited a humanitarian center of the Russian Church in Moscow. As far as I know, the WCC delegation had asked at the time to visit not only the places with the Ukrainians suggested by the Russian side, but also those indicated by the Ombudsman office in Ukraine. So to their credit, they approached the Ombudsman office in Ukraine, asking to help them to identify places which they could visit in Russia, which are not suggested by the Russians. Of course, their request to visit those places were not gratified by the Russians, and they saw only what the Russians wanted them to see. They did not see the Ukrainian prisoners of war and deported Ukrainians held against their will. They also did not see the Ukrainian children, those whose deportation has been qualified by the International Crime Court as the war crime of unlawful deportation of population children and that of unlawful transfer of population children from occupied areas of Ukraine to the Russian Federation in prejudice of Ukrainian children. So the deportation of the Ukrainian children has been condemned, has been identified as crime against humanity by the International Crime Court. And those children were held in those places, facilities, visited by the WCC delegation in the Rostov area. The representatives of the WCC were aware that the Russian Church showed them, this expression, Potemkin village, villages built by Potemkin under Catherine II, to demonstrate some kind of that there are buildings, but there were just facades, walls without really buildings behind them. So that was a facade of the supposed humanitarian aid by the Russian Church shown to the WCC, and was a clear Potemkin village. And the WCC knew it was a Potemkin village and did nothing in order to disclose it. This reminds me of what I saw during my visit to Auschwitz. In the local museum, a part of the exhibition was dedicated to how international organizations inspected the camp. Of course, they were shown only the facade. They probably suspected that there was something worse behind those facades. However, they still participated in covering up the Nazi atrocities. And I believe the WCC participated in covering up the Russian atrocities in this case. In the end, I want to say something positive about the initiatives that the WCC's delegation came up with and discussed with its interlocutors in both Kyiv and in Moscow. I really appreciate the WCC's ideas to bring to the same table the two Ukrainian Orthodox churches, which still do not accept each other, unfortunately. I believe this is an excellent idea. The Council has rich experience and various instruments to facilitate such conversations. From the interview with Jerry Pillai, I concluded that this was the main reason why the WCC's delegation undertook these visits to Kyiv and Moscow. Probably it is the reason why it swallowed all the insults from Moscow. However, the WCC decided to bring to the same table the Russian Orthodox Church. Over many years, I observed the attitude of the Moscow Patriarchate to the possibility of a dialogue between the branches of the Ukrainian Church, Ukrainian Orthodoxy. Never this attitude was even slightly positive. The Russian Orthodox Church always did everything possible and impossible to torpedo such dialogues. Well, my personal story is connected with this. When in the summer 2009, I initiated the dialogue between the Moscow Patriarchate and the Kievan Patriarchate in Ukraine, a few days later, I was removed by Moscow from my position in Ukraine as the head of the Department for External Church Relations of the Ukrainian Church of the Moscow Patriarchate. It was a very clear indication that Moscow was never interested in the dialogue. I realized this, after many tries. And I don't believe that Moscow will want to continue, will want to contribute positively to the dialogue. It accepted the dialogue to participate in the dialogue with the hope that it can impede the dialogue eventually in Geneva. I am aware that all three sides of the potential conversation, the Autocephalous Orthodox Church of Ukraine, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church under the Moscow Patriarchate, and the Moscow Patriarchate, as such, in principle, agreed to sit together. I consulted the Autocephalous Orthodox Church of Ukraine. Was it true that they accepted the invitation of the WCC? They said that the WCC, Jerry Pillai, expressed this invitation to sit on the table with Moscow in a rather vague way, not very firmly, but still understandably. And the Orthodox Church of Ukraine accepted it. And I realize this is true. However, one should not be naive to expect that Moscow has accepted the offer to facilitate the dialogue. Its purpose is to control it and to make sure that it does not bring reconciliation. I think Patriarch Kirill made it quite clear when he offered his own interpretation of the church situation in Ukraine. In the report published by the Moscow Patriarchate about Patriarch Kirill's speech to Jerry Pillai, and there was also a video recording. It was very clear that he accused, the Ecumenical Patriarchate. He accused the Orthodox Church of Ukraine of all sorts of impropriety, all sorts of wrongdoing, which means that he's not disposed to the dialogue with the church, with his partners. If the WCC wants its plan to work in peacemaking, in bringing the two churches, Ukrainian churches, to the same table in Geneva, only the Ukrainian churches should be invited to the round table, I believe. In such a case, the WCC can somehow restore its reputation. If it brings the Russian church to the same table, it will demonstrate that it does not understand and does not want to understand the real situation on the ground, that it prefers the process of peacemaking to its result. Such a round table will be just another Potemkin village of ecumenism and peacemaking. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Father Cyril, for this very powerful commentary on the present situation, and I'm sure we have some questions and comments. So please. I wonder if Tomi Karttunen who opened his camera.
No, there's Juha Meriläinen.
Oh yes, Juha, please.
Thank you so much, Father Hovorun. I'm Juha Meriläinen, theological advisor to the Archbishop of Lutheran Church of Finland. It was very fascinating, and you kind of showed us a vivid picture of the problematic position of the WCC concerning the war in Ukraine and the Russian Orthodox Church. But I would like you to go, if possible, a little bit deeper, even though it might require a bit of speculation. But why is how do you analyze the WCC? Why? I mean, of course, the Russian Orthodox Church tries, as you told us, tries to influence the WCC, but in the member churches, there are quite a broad spectrum of opinions and positions towards the war. But why the leadership of the WCC has taken such a position that it has?
Well, speaking bluntly, if I may, I could say that if you take, for example, the position of Father Ioan Savka, I think it was influenced to a great extent by the position of the Romanian Orthodox Church, which tries to be neutral in this position. So it was not impartial position; it was a partial position that reflected a very particular part, in the process, the Romanian Orthodox Church. When it comes to Jerry Pillai, well, he's very new to the position, and that's why I said that I hope that he would, he would improve, the standing and the policies of the church. But I explain, it's very speculative from my side, but I would explain his attitude by him coming from the global south. And the truth is that the global south and the churches from the global south, they perceive the war in Ukraine from a very different perspective, from the post-colonial perspective. For them, this is a war of the evil West against Russia, for many of them. This is a complete misreading of the war, I believe, because Russia protagonizes in the war as a new colonial power. Russia tries to colonize Ukraine, essentially. But in the global south, it is seen not like this. In many cases, it is seen as a continuation of the colonial policies of the West, particularly the United States. And this is a colonial war, but it is a colonial war fought from the West against Russia. And I think many churches who are members of the WCC, they either explicitly or implicitly hold to this understanding, to this reading of this war. And I believe the WCC's Central Committee and other administrative bodies, including the leaders, the General Secretary, could be under the spell of this interpretation of the war. And I think this is problematic. That's why we need really conversations. We need to talk. We need to discuss in the framework of the WCC this war in order to really to come to a conclusion what it is. It is colonial, but it is not colonial in the way how many churches perceive this war.
Thank you. Tomi Karttinen.
No, thank you. I'd like to ask, are there any, how do you see the possible scenarios for unified Orthodox Church in Ukraine? Are there such any realistic scenarios for the future development?
Yeah, unfortunately, both churches in Ukraine are not interested to be together. That's very unfortunate. And, the Ukrainian society has been solidarized tremendously as a result of the war. Sometimes we have a joke that Putin is the best unifier of Ukraine because all those factions that fought each other all of a sudden, found themselves on the same page. And they now fight back against Putin in solidarity. The only paragon, the only factor in the Ukrainian society that still divides the society are the churches, unfortunately, the Orthodox churches. I don't mean all the churches. I mean, the Lutheran Church, for example, in Ukraine is very positive, it's very constructive, but not the Orthodox churches. And it's really difficult to bring them together. And that's why I praise the initiative of the WCC, to bring them together. It's really great. It's really important. However, it can be counterproductive if Russians are invited as well. I also believe that the ecumenical patriarchate can play a key role in facilitating the reconciliation, the dialogue between the two churches. I hope that my own scenario for the two churches is that they need first to engage into a dialogue, into a conversation, real conversation, not just a pretension, not just an imitation of conversation as they had before, to engage in a real conversation and then to discuss how structurally they could get closer to each other in order eventually to form some kind of confederation or federation of jurisdictions, so to say, in Ukraine. That would be probably a good solution for both churches, but it will take time, yes, probably, and it should be facilitated. And the WCC has now this dilemma to be a good facilitator of good things or to impede things. If they bring Russians to the table, I believe they will throw the reconciliation even further to the future.
Thank you. Kerttu Auvinen.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for the insightful presentation and powerful messages. I would like to ask more about this. You brought the difference of peace and just peace. I think it was very well put in the beginning, the goal of a just peace. So yeah. I would like to ask that what would be your advice for faith-based actors and churches outside of Ukraine, how to approach this topic of just peace and how to support the Ukrainian actors in the steps towards the just peace, even now in the times of war. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I think, first of all, the principle of medicine should be applied. Any doctor promises not to harm first the patient, and then to help. So any help should start with the promise not to harm. Peace and reconciliation, that is important. And I believe that's something that the WCC has a problem with. Then everyone speaks about just peace. Well, originally they spoke about peace, just peace, simply peace. And now they speak about just peace, which is good. But still they understand just peace in different ways. I prefer to speak about sustainable peace. Sustainable peace means that after the ceasefire, the war will not reoccur. Like there were efforts to bring peace to Ukraine after 2014. And as we saw, those efforts did not bring sustainable peace. They gave just Russia an opportunity, to accumulate force and power and to launch this war against Ukraine. Therefore, after Putin is defeated, after war ends, we need to make sure that war will not reoccur in Europe, in Ukraine. That's why I think every peace initiative should take into consideration the perspectives of the peace after the war. It should be sustainable. And I think it should be based on two things. First of all, clearly, in this situation, I believe it's a crime. It would be a crime to speak about any kind of frozen conflict. It should not be frozen. It should be resolved. There should be a clear, I believe, end of this war. And I think it should end with the defeat of Russia. No way for Russia to get away with this. Then the perpetrator should be prosecuted. That's for sure. Should not be spared. Should not be given, a chance to get away with this war. And only when the victims are consoled and are treated as victims, and only when the perpetrators are treated as perpetrators, that is a precondition sine qua non for just peace and sustainable peace for Ukraine, I believe. And the churches should contribute to this. For example, I just want to mention, I read the interview of one of the delegates of the WCC to Kiev. He didn't go to Moscow though. The German Lutheran bishop, who suggested, let us not send arms to Ukraine. Let us, provide intelligence. Let us, start disarming. But speaking realistically, imagine that his ideas are implemented, in Ukraine, and the West, decreases its support to Ukraine, stops sending arms, provides only intelligence. We will be finished, after 1 month or so. Of course, many peacemakers will be happy because their, comfort would be addressed in this way. Well, they would feel themselves, well, okay, we did everything for peace. We, supported pacifism and, not sending arms to Ukraine. Of course, those poor Ukrainians disappeared from the face of the earth well, it's a shame, but we were gratified. I think this is not the way how we do peace. Peace should not be done for the sake of, good feeling about myself. I feel good about myself because my ideas, my agenda about peacemaking have been implemented, and the result can be disastrous, for the people on the ground. That should be taken into consideration, not to pursue our own good feeling, but to pursue the real peace on the ground, and people stop dying.
Thank you, and thank you, Kerttu, for very excellent question. We have one question, time for one question. Laura Reinilä, please.
First of all, I would like to thank you very much for the whole presentation. You opened, as a background, I could tell that I have lived in Ukraine. I have worked there as a Finnish ambassador, and that was at the beginning of 2003, 2007, and I've experienced some of the things that you were referring to. For instance, that Ukrainian nationalism is something which is not like Russian nationalism, which was the Soviet identity, Soviet culture, Russian culture. Ukrainian culture didn't exist. Ukrainian language didn't exist. Ukrainian identity didn't exist. It was Russian or Soviet. So, this as a background. But now, as we are in the situation where we are, I would like to, I was shocked the last remarks you mentioned about this Lutheran bishop from Germany talking nonsense in this situation, not understanding the situation at all. So what should we Lutheran churches do in this situation, as if we are that blind?
Well, I think the Lutheran Church has a very helpful experience after the World War II of overcoming its own weaknesses, because, the Lutheran theology had contributed somehow to, the worst cases of the Lutheran theology, to the totalitarian ideologies of the 30s, for example. There were some really pitfalls in which the Lutheran theology had fallen. And then after the World War II, there was a kind of a renewal, a rethinking, a profound rethinking of theology. That's how the theology after Auschwitz was born. And I think what I would really appreciate as an Orthodox theologian to learn from the Lutheran theologians is how the Lutheran theology managed to change its mindset, change its its understanding of those totalitarian ideologies and theology, how the Lutheran theology managed to get rid of what I call totalitarian theologies or theological trends. In theology, we in the Orthodox theology, we have those trends. We have developed a sort of totalitarian theology that supports that, helps this war to continue. And we need to do the same way of overthrowing this totalitarian ideology. We have to have our own theology after Auschwitz, so to say, which will be called probably theology after Bucha, or something like that. And we really need the experience and knowledge of the Lutheran theology. I humbly accept this as an Orthodox theologian. We need a knowledge and experience of the Lutheran theology in overcoming the totalitarian trends and in helping us to develop our own non-totalitarian or anti-totalitarian theology.
Thank you, Father Cyril. And to this note, it is very, very good to end our session. And I must say that you're a very clever man, Father Cyril, because you came out some uplift. Now we think that we can be part of the solution, we Lutherans, and as we are in a seminar of a Lutheran Church, that was a very encouraging words that you ended with. So thank you, Father Cyril.
Thank you. And again, I apologize for being late. It's my fault.
No.
Mea culpa completely.
No, it's okay. We in Finland we have this saying: it's always worth of waiting for the good. And this was excellent hour spent. So thank you once more, Father Cyril, and I'm sure we are meeting again. We are always very interested of your very insightful insights.
Thank
So
you so
thank you
much.
all. Thank
Thank
you.